Collide 4 is the new module from Geranalog, made in collaboration with experimental musician and YouTube personality Heinbach. It's a careful recreation of the functions of a lock-in amplifier, a piece of laboratory test equipment that was repurposed for making music by early electronic music pioneers like Karlheinz Stockhausen. Collide 4 arrived on the Eurorack scene riding a wave of excitement and enthusiasm. But what makes Collide 4 so exciting? After all, so many of its functions can be found in modules that already exist. To me, it's not so much what Collide 4 is, it's what it represents. It's the idea of using laboratory test equipment to make music that's exciting. The sound of sine waves and pinging filters, creating alien landscapes that sound untouched by human hands. And all with an interface that gives you no assistance whatsoever. These are machines that force you to slow down, listen carefully, and find the music within the noise. So personally, I would put Collide 4 in a similar category to the vintage reissues from Buchla and Surge. There may be less expensive options that will get you similar results. You choose Collide 4 for the aesthetics, the workflow, and to feel a special connection to the history and heritage of electronic music. It starts with the amplifier section, which is mainly used to process external audio signals. You can use the monitor output to listen directly to what's happening in this section. First, the audio hits a preamplifier, where you can choose between 6 different levels of amplification, from -20 decibels all the way up to 30 decibels. This is enough gain to absolutely decimate both Eurorack and line-level signals. Next, the audio hits a bandpass filter with adjustable frequency, width, and resonance. Finally, the audio hits a second amplifier, this one under voltage control. Unlike most VCAs, this one cannot decrease the volume of the signal, only increase it. If you were using Collide 4 for science, then you could use this VCA to boost the signal after the filter to get the loudest, undistorted signal possible. If you're using Collide 4 for music, then it gives you a second chance to completely destroy the incoming audio. The indicator light turns from blue to red if the signal is distorting either before or after the filter. Unlike most filters where you have to use your ears to tell if the signal is saturating, Collide 4 intends to leave no ambiguity. This precise visual feedback dominating the interface really does replicate the feeling of using a piece of laboratory test equipment. But to be honest, in practice I've found the signal will begin audibly clipping before the indicator light turns orange, so you can't entirely rely on it. You will notice that the amplifier section has 2 audio inputs. They can be used to mix 2 audio signals together. Practically speaking, they are identical, except that the negative input inverts the incoming signal. We can tell this if we send the same signal to both inputs. They will almost completely cancel each other out. Once again, I have a feeling that this somewhat odd design choice would make a lot more sense in the context of a device made for science and not for music. And of course, the bandpass filter can do more than just filter incoming sound. It is also a sound source all its own. The line on the filter resonance knob makes it clear that this is considered a core feature of Collide 4. Turn the resonance past this line, and you will hear the filter begin to self-oscillate. Plug a signal from your sequencer or keyboard into the center or frequency modulation input, and the filter will track a volt per octave. The VCA can be used to add distortion for a more complex tone. The presence of the ping input is another indicator that the filter in Collide 4 was intended as a sound source all its own. Pinging refers to the sound a resonant filter makes when you feed it a short transient sound and turn the resonance not to the point of full self-oscillation, but to that liminal space in between, where the resonant frequency just begins to bleed into the silence. This creates a pleasant, natural-sounding decay without the need for an envelope generator. The ping input makes this sound much easier to obtain. It generates the transient sound internally and can be triggered from a gate signal or even a slow-moving control voltage, like this DC offset I'm raising and lowering by hand. Once the rising voltage crosses the threshold, a transient is fired. The next section of Collide 4 is a straightforward sine wave oscillator, with its own set of outputs that we're listening to now. The oscillator has coarse and fine tuning, a volts per octave input, exponential frequency modulation, linear through zero frequency modulation, and a switch to turn it into an LFO, creating slow-moving sine waves that can be used as a control voltage. Here is the bandpass filter and oscillator playing together. If you turn the switch above the filter controls from free to track, then the frequency of the filter will follow the frequency of the oscillator. You can still adjust the frequency of the filter and it will act like an offset, meaning you can tune a harmonic relationship between the filter and oscillator and it will stay consistent as you play. This makes Collide 4 easy to use as a simple FM synthesizer, using the filter to frequency modulate the sine wave oscillator. The oscillator has two outputs that are mostly identical. One is the direct sound from the oscillator. The other is the same sound phase shifted by 90 degrees. Here's what that sounds like. Phase shifting in this case doesn't produce any audible difference in the sound because the waveform hasn't changed shape. It's simply been shifted over relative to the original. We can hear this if we listen to both the original and the phase-shifted copy at the same time. For example, with the oscillator in LFO mode, we can use both outputs to get two cycling control voltages that are rhythmically offset. Finally, the output section is where we find the true heart of Collide 4. There are 3 pairs of outputs, each growing successively more complex. First, we'll look at X' and Y', which are considered Collide 4's primary outputs. Both of them are ring modulators, which multiply 2 signals together, and by default, they take these signals from the amplifier section and the oscillator section. Right now you're listening to X'. If we turn the oscillator back into LFO mode, you can hear more clearly what's happening. The signal from the amplifier section is having its volume or amplitude modulated by the sine wave oscillator. When I turn the frequency of the oscillator up into audio range, it starts to sound a bit like a radio from an old science fiction movie. This is the classic effect known as ring modulation, practically as old as electronic music itself. Now you're hearing X' and Y' playing together, panned hard left and right. The handy graphic above the output section reminds us which signals feed into these 2 outputs. X' multiplies together X and I, Y' multiplies together Y and Q. 4 signals colliding. I and Q are the 2 outputs of the sine wave oscillator, which we've already heard. I is the in-phase or direct sound of the oscillator. Q is the quadrature or phase-shifted version of the oscillator. At LFO rates, you'll hear that familiar 90-degree phase difference between them. The output of the amplifier section is split into 2, and these become X and Y. Here's what those sound like without any ring modulation occurring. If the switch at the top is flipped to the left, then X and Y are identical. If it's flipped to the right, then the 2 signals pass through a dome filter, which creates a 90-degree phase difference between them, similar to the outputs of the sine wave oscillator. We're going to keep this switch to the right, since we need this in order to get the very cool effect that's available at the next pair of outputs. Keep in mind that X, Y, I, and Q can all be any signal you want by using the inputs along the bottom row. For example, here we're multiplying together signals from contour 1 and generate 3. Collide 4 is only supplying the ring modulator. No other section of Collide 4 is affecting the sound. But let's return to the default internal routing. The sum and difference outputs combine together X' and Y'. The difference output subtracts Y' from X', which eliminates parts of the signal, leaving us with this. This is called frequency shifting. As you can hear, the frequency of the amplifier section is being shifted up as the frequency of the oscillator increases. The sum output adds Y' to X', giving us similar results except in the other direction. Frequency shifting is similar to pitch shifting, except that it doesn't preserve the ratios between the sound's harmonic overtones. You may have heard about the difference between frequency shifting and pitch shifting before, but what does it really mean? Let's have a little acoustics refresher. The perceived pitch of a sound is determined by the fundamental, or bass frequency. This is the note that you hear, in this case, G3. The timbre of the sound is determined by the overtones. You can think of these as many sine waves all at different frequencies above the fundamental. If the overtones are at integer multiples of the fundamental, that is, if the overtones are twice the frequency of the fundamental, 3 times the frequency of the fundamental, 4 times, etc., then the overtones are said to be harmonic. This gives us the pleasing timbre of instruments like, for example, the cello. If the overtones are not at integer multiples, let's say they're at 3.6 times the frequency, 4.2 times the frequency, etc., then the sound is noisier, metallic, and the fundamental pitch is harder to discern, like the sound of this cymbal. In pitch shifting, like this digital sampler is doing, the ratios between overtones are preserved, and more of the character of the sound is retained. Because the overtones are still at integer multiples of the fundamental, this cello sound remains harmonic and recognizable as a stringed instrument. In frequency shifting, the ratios between the overtones are destroyed. The sound is pulled apart. It becomes inharmonic and metallic sounding. Individual overtones begin to peak out over others, and it almost starts to sound like a cluster of sine waves existing with no relation to each other. Listen to what happens to this raw square wave. At first, my brain hears this as a single unified tone. As I frequency shift it upwards, I start to hear the fundamental itself as a simple sine wave separate from the overtones above it. Now when I return the sound to its original form, I can still hear the fundamental on its own, even though the sound is no longer being modified. It's an auditory illusion, as if the fundamental has been exposed and can no longer hide. But now back to the features of Collide 4. The time constant knob sounds complicated, but it's actually just a low-pass filter following X' and Y', which can be used for additional tone shaping. The switch at the top changes the frequency range that the filter operates on. If you're using it on audio, you'll want to keep it high. If you're using it as a slew limiter on control voltages, you'll want to keep it low. Finally, there is the magnitude and phase outputs. Both of these combine X' and Y' together, similar to the sum and difference outputs, but the math here is far more complex. Feel free to consult the manual if you feel like brushing up on your calculus. But here is a rough, untechnical summary of how they behave. Once again, we'll listen to just the output of the amplifier section, processed through the magnitude and phase outputs with no ring modulation occurring. Here is the dry signal. Now here it is through the magnitude output. The magnitude output basically sums the two outputs together, except that it always outputs a positive voltage. As the original signal dips into the negative, the magnitude output flips it around back into the positive. Because we're only hearing half the voltage range, the output is distorted but relatively quiet. The sound is discordant and a little reminiscent of ring modulation. The phase output is much louder and harsher. Its output is based on the ratio between the two signals rather than their absolute values. This results in wide and sudden voltage swings that will make even very quiet signals sound like they're clipping and distorting. Combine this output with the extreme amounts of gain available at the amplifier section, add in some filtering from the time constant knob, and you can render a signal truly unrecognizable. Don't forget to use the phase output on LFOs and envelopes for some unique and unpredictable control voltages. Use the time constant knob as a slew limiter for even more unexpected results. Now that we know what Collide 4 does, it's time to see how we might use it in a wider performance context. I rather like this small performance case I've assembled. Most of the modules maintain that monochromatic silver on black look, which helps to give a clinical test equipment feel. In the spirit of making music on hard mode, we will use no external equipment, meaning no dedicated sequencer. This limits our options considerably, forcing us to think more creatively about how we patch. For this first patch, I want to see what we can make using nothing but sine waves. We'll start with 4 sine waves, each tuned to different frequencies coming from different modules in the rack. I'll use these to create 2 different submixes. The one from Quadrat will go to Collide 4 to be ring modulated. The submix from Morph 4 will be fed dry into the final mix. Finally, we'll use the magnitude output from Collide 4 to add a sharper, more distorted sound for contrast. And this is mirrored by the minimum output on Morph 4, which behaves similarly. By simply raising and lowering the level of each sine wave in each of the 2 submixes, we're able to get a wide range of tones and textures. In this second patch, I want to take advantage of Collide 4's biggest feature, which is having all of those outputs available simultaneously. My idea is to have an original signal that is frequency shifted up and down, together with the output of the sine wave oscillator, all present in the final mix. Here's our original signal, a weird little groove giving test equipment vibes. Now we're going to add in the sine wave oscillator, giving it some subtle frequency modulation for texture. Here is our original signal again. Now here is the difference output, which should have a flavor of both the original signal and the sine wave oscillator. Now we'll add in the sum output. This is a little dry even for me. Let's juice it up a little by bringing Generate 3 up into audio range. Here is one more variation on the same idea. Next, I wanted to make a patch that was a little more rhythmic. At first, I didn't know how to do this without a dedicated sequencer, and then I remembered that we have Morph 4, which can do almost anything. Here, it's acting as a simple 4-step rhythm sequencer. Each of the 4 VCAs is sending a signal to ping Collide 4. Now we'll add some distortion and drop the pitch to really put Collide 4 in its element. Now we'll add in the sine wave oscillator as a second voice that's triggered by the same pattern, and add some variation by simply muting and unmuting notes. Here's a more distorted version of the second voice, courtesy of the phase output. Finally, I will leave you today with a happy accident that occurred when I was experimenting with ring-modulated drones. We'll start with 2 oscillators tuned a perfect fifth apart. And then we'll send each of these separately to Collide 4 to be ring-modulated. This turns each of these tones into 2 different tone clusters that, when played one after another, create a lovely sense of tension and release. Now, we'll simply add in the original tones and have the filter in Collide 4 ping us away into the night. going to end our explorations of Collide 4 there for now. Thank you so much for watching, and by the way, welcome to my YouTube channel. I hope to be bringing you a lot more content on experimental electronic music and gear, so if you'd like to see more, please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you, and have a lovely evening.